Hello again. In the last lecture, we learned that when economists talk about efficiency, they mean Pareto efficiency, and that the allocation of society's resources is Pareto efficient when the rich get what they want. Economists often fill official posts, and when they do, they dutifully apply what they have learned. If a policy is not Pareto efficient and it exists, abolish it. And if it is not Pareto efficient and it is advocated, block it. But as we have seen in the last lecture, eliminating policies that are not Pareto efficient, like rent control, would create misery unless the losers, usually the poor, are compensated. Economists refuse to call for this compensation. Instead, they have adopted what is known as the Kaldor-Hicks criteria, which will also be covered in this lecture. In a country where workers do not earn enough to afford food, bread is often the main ingredient in workers' diets. This is because the government subsidizes it. It buys wheat at full price in the world market and then sells it to bakers at a lower price. In a lecture at the World Economic Forum, Professor Jeffrey Frankel of Harvard explained why he is against food subsidies. Few policies place good economics so directly at odds with good politics as subsidies for food and energy, says Professor Frankel. The issue of unaffordable subsidies is now front and center for three of the world's most important new leaders: Egyptian President Sisi, Indonesian President Widodo, and Indian Prime Minister Modi. Sisi is confronting the need to cut subsidies better than might have been expected, tells us Professor Frankel. Modi, by contrast, is doing worse than expected, even torpedoing a long-anticipated World Trade Organization agreement. With Jokowi, it is too soon to tell. Egypt's food subsidy program, which costs more than $5 billion a year, is in urgent need of reform as well. The price of bread has been kept so low that it is often fed to animals. Past attempts to reduce such subsidies in North African countries have brought unrest and even toppled governments. But the Sisi government appears to be making progress here as well. Bread subsidies have already been cut by 13%. Professor Frankel is not the first economist to argue that what's between a poor country and development are food subsidies. Professor Frankel only exhorted President Widodo of Indonesia to abolish food subsidies, but already 16 years earlier, in 1998, his colleague at Harvard, Larry Summers, as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, was able to force the President of Indonesia at the time, Suharto, to actually abolish them. The results were food riots and death, and Summers had to not only let Suharto reinstate the subsidies, but send American food as well, because the US was blamed for the hunger its intervention caused. There is no doubt that subsidies create waste, but hunger is not a better alternative. The need for food subsidies arises from low wages. The minimum wage in the capital of Indonesia is $303 a month. The CIA publishes a World Factbook about the countries of the world, and its assessment is that Indonesian workers are unable to afford food because Indonesia does not have enough infrastructure and it has too much corruption. The government of Indonesia consumes only 9% of the country's GDP, whereas the US government consumes 17%. Of course, given how poor the country is, in order to build an infrastructure that is comparable to that of the United States, the Indonesian government would have to consume a larger, not smaller percentage of the country's GDP. Food subsidies in Indonesia are needed because the government of Indonesia spends too little, not too much. In his criticism of food subsidies in Egypt, Professor Frankel identified two problems. Bread is so cheap it's fed to animals, and rich people also benefit from the subsidies. Even if both problems were significant, the question will still remain whether hunger is a better alternative. But in fact, by the time Professor Frankel gave his talk, Egypt was already tackling these problems effectively. The government of President Morsi, the only democratic government that Egypt ever had, introduced a food smart card in 2013. The smart card is issued only to eligible families, and each person is limited to 5 loaves of bread a day. What has not been solved is the need for the subsidies. The government of Egypt has to assure its citizens repeatedly that bread subsidies will continue uninterrupted. The finance minister made this promise in 2018. The Minister of Supplies made the same promise in 2019. But the coronavirus has been used by the Egyptian government to increase repression. So even though poverty is rising, in August 2020, the Egyptian government announced a cut in the weight of a loaf of bread while keeping the price of the loaf and the number of loaves a person is entitled to constant. One wonders, do Professors Frankel and Summers approve? What's between Egypt and a flourishing economy are not food subsidies, but a military dictatorship that elevates incompetence. The Egyptian military owns much of the industry in the country, from the production of refrigerators to greenhouses and gyms. These industries assure officers who have no managerial skills in industry high-paying jobs when they retire, while the profits finance the military itself. Profits are high because wages are low. Workers cannot oppose the military. These problems started with the dictator Mubarak, who was ousted by street protests and replaced by the democratically elected Morsi. Under the current dictator, Sisi, who deposed Morsi through a military coup, the problem only became bigger. President Trump says that Sisi is his favorite dictator, but actually, Sisi is your and my favorite dictator too. While we are against food subsidies, we are giving a subsidy of $1.3 billion a year to Sisi's military, which he uses to suppress the protests about which Professor Frankel marvels why they do not occur. Social Security is another government program that is under attack by economists, although the latest attack is well disguised, as we shall see. Martin Feldstein, who died in 2019, was a professor of economics at Harvard, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors of President Reagan, and an economic advisor to President Obama. In this picture he is with President Bush because he was well known for his claim that Social Security is inefficient and therefore the ideal economist to justify President Bush's attempt to privatize Social Security. According to Professor Feldstein, workers lose from Social Security because of it they save less, and as a result the level of savings in the economy is lower. When there is less savings, there is less investment, and when there is less investment, workers are less productive and their wages are lower. Therefore, Social Security is Pareto inefficient. We will examine Professor Feldstein's specific claim in a minute, but it should be noted that Feldstein sees old age as a strictly private matter, whereas in reality, old age and therefore Social Security are both also social matters. Would we be okay with old people in our midst living their last days in desperation? Do we want families to be crushed by the care of their old parents? Our answers to both questions have been no, and this is reflected in the financial structure of Social Security. Social Security is redistributive. The benefits to low-income workers equal about half the pay during the working days, whereas for high-income workers, that ratio is only about a quarter. Benefits do not depend at all on the interest rate that exists at a particular point in time. By contrast, private annuities are cheap when the interest rate is high and expensive when the interest rate is low. Social Security benefits increase with inflation, regardless of how high the inflation rate is. Private annuities, by contrast, kept the increase in benefits due to inflation, typically at 2.5%. Social Security is risk-free. By contrast, insurance companies that offer annuities may fail. 74 insurance companies failed between 1988 and 2009, and customers lost 6% of their money. Professor Feldstein's claim that because of Social Security, workers save less, and therefore there is less savings in the economy, consists of two parts. First, a claim that without Social Security, workers would have saved more. The Wall Street Journal tells us that when there was no Social Security, workers saved very little for retirement, and their old age was very bleak. In 1934, 1 year before Social Security was created, a government advisor wrote that in the United States, many workers can escape the economic problems of old age only by dying before their period of superannuation, meaning retirement, sets in. Today, many workers do have retirement savings accounts, but it appears to be due to the Social Security law. It seems that the requirement that employers share half the cost of Social Security accomplishes two things. It covers half of the cost, but in addition, it places retirement at the center of workers' and employers' expectation of what a wage should pay for. Before there was Social Security, there were no 401k programs, but today there are, and not only workers, but some employers, often forced by unions, also contribute to them, and the taxes on these payments are deferred. Hence, Social Security may have increased the propensity of workers to save rather than diminish it. Of course, despite the increase in private savings, Social Security remains the most important source for retirement income. Among elderly Social Security beneficiaries, 50% of married couples and 70% of unmarried persons receive 50% or more of their income from Social Security. 21% of married couples and about 45% of unmarried persons rely on Social Security for 90% or more of their income. But even if Feldstein were right, if without Social Security workers would have saved more during their working lives, this would not have meant that without Social Security, savings in the economy as a whole would have increased. The level of savings in the economy is the balance between the funds that workers save and the funds that retirees withdraw. If workers who saved more during their working days also spend more when they retire, total savings in the economy would not change. Ultimately, Professor Feldstein's claim is empirical, and the evidence does not support it. The evidence does not show that Social Security causes savings in the economy to decrease. Feldstein's claim that workers' wages increase when investments in the economy increase is not true either. This graph shows the growth in productivity and in workers' wages since 1948. Until 1979, wages grew at practically the same rate as productivity, but from then on, wages started lagging far behind. Between 1979 and 2018, productivity increased by 69%, while wages increased by only 12%. The close relationship between the growth of productivity and of wages of the good old days is now gone. Professor Feldstein is dead, but economists have revived this claim that workers do not save enough. Unlike him, though, they don't blame Social Security for it, they blame the workers themselves. Richard Thaler, a Nobel laureate, and other behavioral economists claim that the workers are either not rational or lack self-control, and propose means to nudge them towards the correct behavior. Their solution involves private savings accounts. President Bush's dream of privatizing Social Security is closer to becoming a reality. This current attack on Social Security starts with the alarming fact that one-third of American households headed by a person 55 years and older have no savings. Another Fed study discovered that 39% of Americans would not be able to cover a $400 emergency expense without a credit card loan. These are the results of the stagnating wages that we have just noticed, and they call for social responses. One social response would be to increase wages so that people can afford to save more. The minimum wage should be increased, and laws that depress wages, such as the Right to Work law and the Employment at Will law, should be abolished. Another social response would be to raise the benefits that Social Security pays. Raising the benefits does not call for increasing the Social Security tax rate. All it calls for is making all income subject to the Social Security tax. One exemption from the tax is for high income. Income above $137,700 is not subject to the Social Security tax. Then we notice, perhaps with amazement, that whereas the Social Security tax rate is 12.4%, Social Security benefits are only 4.62%, less than 5% of GDP. What explains this difference in percentages? What explains it is all the income that is not taxed. First, there is the cap that we have already mentioned. Then there are all the types of income that are not taxed. Capital gains are not taxed. Interest income is not taxed. Dividend income is not taxed. Corporate income is not taxed. There is no justification for making distinctions between types of income, and all of it should be taxed. Then benefits would be 12.4% of GDP, almost 3 times as high as they are today, without increasing the Social Security tax rate at all. But none of this is happening. Instead, Oregon, California, and Illinois are creating retirement savings accounts. These programs automatically divert 5% of an employee's paycheck into a retirement account. Low-paid workers work for employers who do not offer retirement plans. Low-paid workers can only save small amounts. Because their accounts would be small, they are excluded from buying the products of investment firms. Therefore, low-paid workers saving less than they want to does not call for psychological explanations. The states lifting low-paid workers up would be a positive step, but instead they are enticing low-paid workers to assume risks that would be devastating to them, while failing to do what only governments can do, provide workers with Social Security. Let's look at Oregon's program, for example. These are some of the frequently asked questions about Oregon's state program. Let's read them. First, there is the risk of loss. The person who wrote this page calls it some risk, but the subprime crisis do two things at the same time. It caused millions of workers to lose their jobs, and it caused the stock market to collapse. Had Oregon Saves, the state program, existed then, retired low-paid workers would have been made destitute by it. And low-paid workers who lost their jobs and wanted to withdraw their savings would have found that these are gone. The loss does not have to come from the stock market, however. A person may invest in what's called a risk-free investment and still lose because of inflation. Had Oregon Saves existed in the 1970s, its retirees would have become destitute by annual inflation rates of 10% and above that were caused by two oil shocks. Is there any guarantee of earnings on my investments? No. All investing involves some risk and there is no guarantee of earning. Take out the word some, and this is a truthful answer. Social Security is an excellent program, and there is simply no need and no justification to devise other retirement programs that are inferior to it to supplement or replace it. But the Social Security benefits are not sufficient to guarantee a decent old age to all. They should therefore be raised. One source of financing the expansion could be to apply the Social Security tax to all types of income, exempting none. Food for thought. Should old age benefits be tied to income during the recipient's working life? Poor people suffer from greater exposure to pollution than rich people. This has been meeting with resistance and a call for environmental justice. The Environmental Protection Agency defines environmental justice. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everybody enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Professor Larry Summers, we have already met. Now is the time to divulge that he was Professor Feldstein's student. In 1991, when he was the chief economist of the World Bank, people concerned with environmental justice argued that multinational corporations should be subject to the same environmental regulations in the third world as in the first world. But Summers disagreed. The economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, Summers said, and we should face up to that. As this rally by coal miners shows, people are willing to be poisoned if the alternative, particularly unemployment, is worse. In 2014, Chester, Pennsylvania agreed to let a trash incinerator with a history of pollution and horrible health effects to expand its operations in return for $12 million. These examples show that people are willing to accept pollution if they get the right compensation for it. We therefore see that the two goals in the Environmental Protection Agency's definition of environmental justice are not always consistent. Consent may lead to a different degree of exposure to pollution. The question is what to do when manufacturing moves to undemocratic countries where consent is not required and therefore compensation will not be paid. Should such moves be banned? The economics profession has adopted two criteria to answer this question, and by these criteria, economists should not concern themselves with the consequences of their policy recommendations. One criterion was invented by economist Nicholas Kaldor, and the other by the economist John Hicks. They are similar, so let's read Kaldor's. There is no need for the economist to prove, as indeed he could never prove, that as a result of the adoption of a certain measure, nobody in the community is going to suffer. In order to establish his case that the measure should be adopted, it is quite sufficient for him to show that even if all those who suffer as a result are fully compensated for the loss by the winners, the rest of the community will still be better off than before. Whether the losers should in fact be given compensation or not is a political question on which the economist, qua economist, could hardly pronounce an opinion. So when Larry Summers argued that the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, he was right. And when he and Professor Frankel pushed for the abolition of food subsidies, they were just practicing what they have learned in school. Will there be hunger if food subsidies are abolished? We are economists. This is not our concern. But if the economic logic means that rent control and food subsidies should be abolished, Social Security privatized, and environmental justice stopped, the question is, where does it leave the rest of us? Larry Summers tells us that we should face up to this logic, and he is right. The logic of economics right now equates wealth with dollars. This makes it economics for the rich. The alternative is to equate wealth with utility, and this will be economics for the rest of us. Food for thought. Are there conditions that will make wealth in dollars and wealth in utility largely the same?